So hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast brought to you by the PVRI and the Dinosaur Trust. I'm Jamie Strachan, the chairman of the Dinosaur Trust. We're closely associated with the PVRI through our Charitable Trust and work very closely together to try to find cures and better treatments for pulmonary artery hypertension. I'm here today with my good friend Mark Toshner. And Mark and I are going to have a conversation about treatments and care around pulmonary artery hypertension. Mark's obviously an expert in the field, being a lecturer of translational research. Sorry, I should say that again, translational respiratory research at Cambridge. And he's been a big part of our lives for many years, working with Professor Nick Morell. So great to see you, Mark.
Hi, Jamie. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I forgot to also say that this podcast is titled Breathing Science. So for everyone who's listening, this is a breathing science podcast. Mark and I go quite a long way back, and I thought it'd be good for Mark and I just to have a chat together about where we've come from over the years and where we are now. And it'll probably be just me asking Mark a few questions and Mark giving us lots of amazing information. So if that sounds okay with you, Mark.
Happy to crack on, go for it.
Fantastic. So yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to just ask first and foremost, going back probably, many years to when we launched the Dinosaur Trust, you and Professor Nick Morell were working on the NPR2 gene mutation work within the lab. Can you tell us a little bit about that, where it was at the time and how it's progressed and where we are now with it?
Really happy to. So when I first came to Cambridge, in fact, I thought I was coming to Cambridge to cure high altitude pulmonary hypertension, was my original plan. And then when I arrived, I hadn't actually heard of BMPR2 or in fact, hadn't really seen a patient with pulmonary arterial hypertension. And I was quite lucky because as well as sort of planning to work in the lab, what I hadn't fully appreciated was just how well established and what a genealogy the clinical service in Cambridge had. And in fact, the original descriptions of vasodilators originated from Cambridge with Tim Higginbottom and Joe Peb-Kazaba. So there was a really, really strong thread of DNA in Cambridge in therapeutics. I originally came to work on endothelial or vascular cell mechanisms of disease, but then seeing the patients and realizing that perhaps high altitude wasn't the biggest need in the area of vascular biology, I kind of pivoted and started working on vascular cell biology with Nick. And I guess when we met, we were about halfway through that story and had been working for some time on animal and cell models, demonstrating that this protein-borne morphogenetic protein type 2 receptor is really critical for most of the familial cases of pulmonary hypertension, but also some of the sporadic or idiopathic cases where previously we would have said we don't know what's happening here. And at that point, that was all we thought it was probably going to be relevant to, but I think that's been challenged down the years, and it appears to be a really key pathway for a number of different types of pulmonary hypertension, although we didn't know that at the time. So when I arrived in the lab, we were trying to move away from what we'd previously been studying, which was one particular type of cell called the smooth muscle cell, and towards another type of cell, or to include another type of cell called the endothelial cell. And that's what I spent the next kind of 5 to 10 years studying. But as I did it, and as the data accumulated, and as we realized the story was going to be important and was going to need translated, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a second, I kind of started to change my spots a bit and started to get more involved in clinical trials and moving towards actually being able to be a researcher capable of turning that cell and molecular biology into an actual therapy that we then trial in patients. And that for me has been the kind of direction of my journey, but for reasons that are really simple and obvious. It's all fair and well to spend 10 years defining something beautiful in a lab, but if it never makes it through to therapy, then what have you been spending your time doing? And we'll talk a little bit, I guess, later on about how that's actually translating now, but also how long it's taken for us to get to that point.
Fantastic, Mark. I'm so sorry. I seem to have had a little bit of a delay in my connection here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's great. I was hearing you, but there was just a little pause. So that's fantastic. Yeah, amazing. Obviously, through research, discovering, new, making new discoveries as you go along, and obviously, it would be great to sort of, hear more, learn more about where that's going now. And yeah,
happy to. So in the last 10 years, we've taken a number of different approaches in those animal and cell models to trying to see if we can rescue the function of the pathway. Effectively, what you get when you have a mutation in BMPR2 is you get a critical reduction of a very key protein that is involved in the regulation of the blood vessel. So the question was, can we change that and restore the function of the protein so that the levels are normal and the pathway is functioning again? And then beyond that, is that enough? Because sometimes the damage is done, and even if you restore function, you're not reversing disease. So we've spent a lot of time very carefully trying to demonstrate, if we can do that, and it turns out we definitely can, using a load of different models and a load of different approaches, and pretty robustly shown that. So it took us a long time to accumulate that data and get to the point where we were happy we had enough confidence that the idea was right to then be able to take it into to patients. And that's really what I've spent the last almost 4 years now trying to do, which was, first of all, get some money to run the studies in humans, and then to think about how we would design the trial to be able to answer the question that we're asking. And so that's come to its culmination this last year, where we got funding for the MRC, the Medical Research Council, for a study that we're now calling Stratosphere. And that study is up and running, and its first phase is a study where we try to find the best way of measuring the protein, and then we're going to move on to actually running the clinical trial. But the really great news is, in the interim, while I've sort of spent many years banging my head against the brick wall of trying to get funding for the sort of trials that really are challenging to run, another company called Acceleron has run with the hypothesis, and really that phase 2 study in their drug called sotatercept is the most exciting thing that's happened in pulmonary hypertension for well over a decade, and proves that modulating the pathway we're interested in, the proteins we think are important, really has very exciting therapeutic potential. So whilst we have been beavering away, the proof of concept is out there, and that phase 3 study is now recruiting, or just about to be recruiting if it hasn't started already. And we are pursuing in parallel some different ways of doing the same thing that may be cheaper, and therefore offer a potential for more patients being treated further down the line if it works.
It sounds very interesting what you're talking about, sort of measurement of the protein deficiencies and how to find that. I'm guessing with sotatercepts that they're sort of providing a medical treatment. You take it, and hopefully that does its job. But there's no measurement there, or so you're not able to assess how much might be needed or not. Is that correct? Or
it's a really great question, actually, and it's one I've spent the last 5 years trying to figure an answer for, and I still don't quite know if I've got it yet. So it's a super question. I think the problem is that we're looking at molecular events, but in an organ where it's really hard to get to them. So to look at molecular changes in the lung is just not feasible at the moment with the current technology we have, and we know that biopsying, for example, patients isn't a safe thing to do in pulmonary hypertension. So you're then left with the question of, can you get kind of surrogate signals to try to demonstrate the same thing? And we've gone down a route of trying to look to see if in the blood we can demonstrate what we call target engagement, and we just mean that the drug is doing what we think it's doing. Acceleron went down a different route, which is they just gave the drug to a lot more patients and then looked for an effect.
Yeah.
And that was high risk, because the question about whether the drug is doing what it's supposed to do wasn't answered with that trial. But amazingly, what they just demonstrated was a very big signal in improving the sort of things that you'd measure that have a meaning to a patient further down the line. So things like pulmonary vascular resistance and 6-minute walks have increased in those studies, and so really strong, powerful evidence that the drugs work. But you're right, the question of how much you give and of how often you give it, and of how much effect you're having on the pathway you think you're working on still hasn't been answered. And there's a lot of work to do in that. So we've taken a slightly different route, but in the confidence that at least we know that you can change the way this pathway functions, and it has a meaningful effect on the pulmonary vasculature.
And obviously the protein that we're talking about is BMP9, correct?
So actually that's another route. That's an additional route that's thing. So Nick has gone down a different route entirely. So I'm using cheap drugs that are widely available. Nick has got a whole story where he's basically developing his own therapy. It's a bespoke therapy. It's not like my approach is to use cheap available drugs, but those drugs hit multiple things. His is a very targeted approach, and it's incredibly elegant. And again, that's another way that we're trying to get at the same problem. So hopefully by multiplying the ways we approach the problem, one of them will come off at least. But as in all drug development, there's a lot of big ifs and buts in there. And so we think the most resilient approach is to have more than one approach.
Yeah. What's obviously extremely exciting is that the research has really shown, and obviously these early clinical trials is really showing that it's working, that there is an effect, and that's just so exciting for patients and carers, obviously. I wanted just to sort of ask you, how important is it in early stage research, to have charitable support, charities like the Dinosaur Trust supporting the research that's being done?
Pulmonary hypertension is an orphan disease. And an orphan is a great word here because it really does feel a bit like an orphan sometimes, doesn't it? It's maybe not loved, and it's maybe not showered with attention and money. And so often getting really innovative ideas started is really difficult because there just isn't a funding landscape. And a lot of the time you're not talking about big pots of money or big pots of money compared to other studies. You might be talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds, but probably not millions or tens of millions of pounds. The ability to fund these studies is limited to a very few set of options. And so this is a brilliant space for charitable funding to step into, because you can kind of pump prime, perhaps big ideas, but that require a little bit of capital to try to get, the first bit of data to see if there's even anything in it. And actually that's largely, with a mix of that and a lot of funding from the British Heart Foundation in particular over the years, that's largely how we manage the BMPR2 story. There were other funding that was plugged in, and the industry funding has a role as well. But if we didn't have any charitable funding at all, there would be almost no research in pulmonary hypertension. And it's kind of interesting to kind of reflect on that journey, because quite often the impact down the line of modest investments early can be quite outsized. And a great example of this is the cystic fibrosis community. I don't know if you follow what's happened in cystic fibrosis over the last 10 to 20 years, but the Cystic Fibrosis Trust largely put a big bet to put some money into drug development that has paid off spectacularly and has amazingly impacted on patients' lives in quite profound ways, and generated enormous amounts of money. So some of the companies that then came into that space are some of the highest earning companies in healthcare. Now you can ask moral questions about that, but what is unequivocal is that it has been a complete success story from the patient's end, because there are now life-saving and life-extending drugs that are available that wouldn't have been without that bet and that investment early on from the Cystic Fibrosis Trust.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story, and I know that the patients had to fight very hard to make it available. And this is something that from our perspective, that we're obviously very concerned about. All these wonderful, opportunities that may be there, but yet still there's that final hurdle to get across, and how to sort of commercialize these things, particularly for an orphan disease such as pulmonary hypertension. So, from where we are, we can see that there's still a long way to go, but we take great inspiration from the cystic fibrosis community, and in the hope that what we're doing somewhere down the line, we may also be able to, do something similar. But I think already what's happening with the research that you've been doing, as you say, is the most exciting news we've had in the last 10 years for the treatment of the disease. And my main focus, obviously, just for those who don't know our story, listening in, my son Archie, who's now 13, is a patient suffering with pulmonary artery hypertension. He's currently doing really well, but we've taken a real focus on the pediatric side of things through Archie, and worked very closely with Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. And what we're keen to try to sort of look at is how to sort of develop clinical trials for the pediatric community, with treatments like sotatercept. And I'm keen to know your thoughts on, obviously it's a little bit more difficult to get the pediatric population into a clinical trial, but we feel it's important. What are your thoughts on it?
So I completely agree with that, and it is challenging, and it's challenging for a number of reasons. I think there are historically a very clear story across many different diseases that studies in children are just more difficult to run than in adults, and often what happens is the studies in children lag by years, and often don't actually arrive, and sometimes you end up having to treat children with off-label therapies in the absence of any evidence. A good example being sildenafil, the original sildenafil work, all done in adults, showing a very clear signal, but the drug translated and people were using it in children, and then further down the line people started to realise that in some subsets of children it didn't seem to be doing good. In fact, it was doing harm, and that's a big problem. I think that a culture change is needed. I think it's not actually just restricted to children. I think that we have amazing evidence that patients in trials do better than those that don't enroll in trials, and why that is quite an interesting question, and there are a number of potential answers. But the fact that that's true is just, it's just fact. It's demonstrated time and time again in every disease area. And so I actually think the main challenge that we should be presenting to the community is, why is everybody not in a trial? And that includes the children. I think we need a framework for doing clinical trials where every single patient gets offered a trial, and then it's up to them whether they want to take part in it. And we historically in Cambridge have been, we're a very academic unit. We're incredibly trial positive, but it's rare that we get more than 30% of our patients enrolled in clinical trials, and that's when we're doing our best. So I think as a community we need to up our game, and that involves a lot of changes, and involves changes in how we do trials. They should probably be more patient focused and not around the whims or my schedule. We need to think about how we make trials easier for patients to sign up to. We need to think about how we make trials easier to actually do, and not quite so expensive to run. We need to think about how we approach patients and involve patients in clinical trials. Often in a trial I'll measure a bunch of stuff and I'll be quite happy it will go up or down, but actually there's a huge disconnect by going back and asking the patient, did that mean anything to you? So for example, I mentioned those physiological tests that we often base our trials around earlier, and they are the 6-minute walk and the hemodynamics, but actually they don't track terribly well with how patients feel. Yeah. And so we need a complete sea change in how we think about disease, and how we measure effects in clinical trials, and how we run clinical trials with the patient at the centre of them. And some of that is going to be forced on us actually by the pandemic. The pandemic has changed a lot of our processes through necessity, but also made us think quite profoundly about how we set services up and how we set clinical trials up, because of all the challenges in doing our classical model that brings patients in for a day and does lots and lots of tests to them, for example.
I think that really puts to the forefront the importance of the PVRI in situations like this, because obviously you and I have been part of a group for the International Drug Development Initiative, which is really focused, our group is focused on the patients and exactly what you're talking about, which is, more patient-centric, patient-focused clinical trials. How do we do that? And I think it's going to take some time to work that out. I think it's, as you said earlier, it's not just children. There are different types of adults, and different people have different approaches to their disease and so forth. So it's a complicated field, but I think we've got to sort of approach it with the kind of spirit that you're talking about, which is with an open mind and trying to think firstly about the patient and their well-being. How are they feeling? How are they? Obviously their output is an important marker in that. They probably will be feeling better because of that, but in some cases maybe not. So,
I mean, I have an example of this, but it's not a pulmonary hypertension example that I've recently set up related to COVID. Yeah. And I think it's a really great paradigm for how we should be doing this. We've set up a trial called Heal COVID, which is a study looking at improving longer term outcomes from patients hospitalized with COVID. And from day one, we actually just asked, right, okay, what are the endpoints that are important to patients? And we took data from patient feedback groups, and we went back to patients again and asked them again, what's important to you, and then designed both the primary endpoint and the secondary endpoint around what the patients told us. So actually the patients, the endpoints for those trials were co-produced with patients. Their voice was, primary in us designing that trial. And the trial is decentralized. It's based on apps and phone calls. It's based on minimizing the burden on patients. Yeah. And I'd love to take some of those concepts and apply them to pulmonary hypertension, where I know my patients are going to spend a lot of time with us, and often they're going to be coming back, not necessarily because they need to come back, but because it's more convenient for me for them to come to a hospital. And if anybody out there, watching this has ever been in a clinical trial, you'll know there are a lot of visits. There's a lot of, there's the whole thing is not set up with you in mind; it's set up with us in mind. And so I think that's one of the things that I'd like to challenge in the coming years is how we make these trials easier for patients, more inclusive, therefore, of patients that we might have excluded. So, for example, if you live 100 miles away from a tertiary pulmonary hypertension centre, you're probably not going to want to enrol in a trial, because it might mean going, on a 200-mile round trip 4 times, a month for a week, and once a month for the next 6 months, and that's going to put you off. And we need to change that. We need to change, the patient experience in that trial, and that extends to other groups, outside our classical trial groups. So, the kids are a brilliant example of, we really need endpoints for kids that aren't invasive, that don't put them through any distress, and that meaningfully relate to their function in lives. And in groups of elderly, exactly the same. We often disenfranchise the elderly from our clinical trials for a variety of reasons, and I think we should be asking ourselves, is that the right way to run these trials, and can we do it different?
Yeah, no, I think obviously the past year has helped us gain a lot of insight into how we can do things remotely, obviously, and that's a big factor in looking at the potential to do these things, but also just the technology that we have at our fingertips now, and as you say, apps, and perhaps there may be some new measurement devices that we need to look at or develop to take these measurements somehow. So a lot of focus on that, and where the technology needs to be developed. We need to be thinking about how we fund the development of the technology. But yeah, it's great that I think that there's a general consensus going in that way, particularly for the patients, which is, obviously at the heart of it all. It's fantastic. I wanted to, just on the subject of, the last year, ask you, with the rush of COVID vaccines and development and the speeding up of development of these vaccines, obviously very sort of at times controversial, but what are your thoughts on how that may affect the development of treatments and care in the future for drugs, for pulmonary hypertension and for other diseases.
Yeah, that's a really on point question. I can give you a bit of insight from inside this, because I guess I was involved as an investigator in the Chadox trials, the kind of phase 2-3 Chadox trial that ended up with the vaccine being licensed. The two big takeaways, I think, are that our classical way of doing things in very rigid, predefined phases, it was out the way. It was already a model that people were saying doesn't really work and were challenging. And I think that's just been exploded by how we've been able to run not just the vaccine trials, but also trials like the recovery trial. The other thing is that there are huge economies of scale by better coordinating and by collaborating. And this is an area where I didn't need the pandemic to tell me all of this. In fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, my main aim in the UK in the clinical science space has been to try to support the development of a clinical trials network that includes everybody. And so before the pandemic had come about, we'd spent a number of years in the UK, all of the centres working towards this common goal, and we'd really hit it just as the pandemic started. And in fact, our network, the Unify network, so Unify Pulmonary Hypertension network has everybody in the UK, both at a specialist centre level and at a satellite level, signed up to it, and we are running coordinated trials now. So we were already zealots for this approach, and I think the pandemic has just confirmed it's the right approach for me. But the reason that you don't find a lot of that is that academia can often be a competitive space rather than a collaborative space, and it takes some really good people to be able to put aside that competitive side to it and agree to all just work together. Fortunately, in the UK, we've got that.
Would you say then that a lot of this is skepticism coming from academia over over the vaccines, is coming from a more competitive place rather than a willingness to work together?
I think that's definitely part of the story. And another part of the story is funding. Again, to come back to funding, unfortunately, the types of studies that I envisage are just more expensive because they're bigger in scale and bigger in ambition, and they require a lot of us to work together when the immediate gain from it is going to be delayed, and it's going to be distributed amongst a lot of people, not focused on a few. But we're lucky in the UK because our community buys into that 100%. So we've just finished our first trial, in fact, that is the first trial ever to have every centre in a country contributing to and be investigator-led. That was the Transform UK trial, and that's just about to be published in the ERJ in the coming days. And so that for us was transformative because we demonstrated we could do this. Collectively we could set up the sort of trial that would normally take 5 or 6 years and would probably involve maybe 10 countries and maybe 40 different centres, and we could run it really efficiently in a relatively small network of highly motivated investigators across the UK. And other places have sat up and taken notice. So Steve Provencher, for example, in Canada, who's a great guy who I collaborate with, he immediately has started doing the same thing in Canada, and they've got a trial up and running, and they're going down the same model. And there's interest from other places. And eventually what we'd like to do is put that all together and have the sort of platform trials. And platform trial, if you need me to explain it, I'll be happy to, is a trial that has the capacity to look at more than one thing. And it also stays open, so you can look at things sequentially.
Okay.
And actually that the recovery trial is the big poster child for this, because it's this single trial that has driven almost all of the therapeutic innovation in treating COVID. And it's just one trial, but it's one huge trial run across the whole of the UK that involves basically every healthcare setting or every secondary hospital that's looking after patients. So it involved collaboration on a scale we've never seen before, and it embedded some of the ideas that we talked about earlier about making trials really easy for patients. It was dead simple. And so in the UK, we're ready to do this in pulmonary hypertension. And in fact, the next trial that we run which is the PIPA trial or the Imatinib trial from Martin Wilkins in London, is along that model. And then we've got another couple of trials coming down the road. So I think we're in a very good place. We're a wee bit ahead of the curve actually in pulmonary hypertension. Well, we think we are in the UK, because a lot of the things that everybody's talking about right now, we've been talking about for a few years and been trying to put into practice. So the timing's really good. But again, it requires investment, and we come back to money. And so for pulmonary hypertension, getting money to run trials is always difficult.
I've got a couple of questions that just have come out of that. I mean, firstly, obviously, COVID, there was obviously a big reason to be motivated. So you're going to get the cooperation of many services, or many sort of centres. Do you envisage the same sort of enthusiasm with this model of trial for, obviously something that's a lot smaller in future?
I do, and in fact, I don't even need to envisage it. I know it's the case, because we've already done it. We did it with the Transform trial, and we demonstrated at that point the fastest ever recruitment to an early phase clinical trial that anybody had ever managed, pharma or investigator. So the reason for that is just that we are all pulmonary hypertension doctors, and exactly. we're super motivated to try to find treatments for our patients. So I don't think motivation will be a problem. I think there are people chomping at the bit to enroll in these trials, or to be part of these trials, enrolling them. The challenge in the past has been funding and structure, infrastructure to do it. And the infrastructure thing is a big problem, because you can have all the enthusiasm in the world, but if you don't have a unit that has a robust set of researchers that are there all the time, that aren't dependent funding from year to year, it's really, really hard to sustain the type of unit that you need to be able to deliver it constantly. So there are challenges there.
And in terms of funding, I mean, are we talking huge numbers, or it depends on the trial, I guess? But
depends on the trial, yeah. And one of the things I'd like to do in the next few years is make those trials cheaper by making them simpler and making them more patient focused. But they're not. These are not inexpensive studies. They are much less expensive to run as an investigator than as a company, often by an order of magnitude of 10 times. So the need for an ecology of different types of trials is still there, and industry are really important in this, because it is unusual for therapies to be translated without an industrial partner at some point. And so keeping industry engaged and acting in synergy with them is going to be a really, really important thing going forward. And the sotatercept story is a really great example of that, because almost all of the preclinical science came from labs like ours. But it required a big company to translate it really quickly, and to do it at the kind of scale that we would probably have struggled to do it at speed.
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting. And as you say, essential that industry is involved, and therefore everyone from patients through to clinicians and researchers through to the industry, that everyone is working together to try and get the best outcome. The question I also had was, obviously, you were talking about sort of previously trials sort of lasting up to 5 years or however long. With this new method, I mean, what can we be looking at? What's the future looking like in terms of, from start to finish, getting a therapy available?
So the classical time frame that you always hear is 10 years to develop any new therapy, and that's probably pretty close to the truth. It probably does take 10 years and it depends when you count the first point. If you include some of the preclinical work that we often do, it's probably longer. And in fact, it's taken us longer than 10 years to get to the point with BMPR2 of actually trialing things in humans, and that's pretty standard. It then takes anywhere between another 5 to 10 years to do the trials. And I think the advantage of some of these new ideas is you can do things much quicker. Firstly, by testing more than one thing at a time. So a platform trial plugs in different types of therapy, and it might be looking for a bigger effect. So it might drop things quickly. Or it might be running at a bigger scale, like the recovery trial, and just do it in lots and lots of people, and therefore shortening the idea of having one very small trial, a medium-sized trial, and a big trial, just going after big from early. So there are a number of different ways I think we can reduce that development time frame, but it still takes time. And so the translation of an idea through to an actual therapy for humans isn't a straightforward thing. Some of these new ways of doing things will improve that, but we're still going to be talking years and not months. And that's unavoidable if you want to keep it safe and you want to keep it affordable, and you don't want to rush trials through before you think the therapies have demonstrated enough kind of equipoise from the perspective of, are we excited enough about this therapy and do we think it will be safe? So I think some of it's unavoidable, but some of it can be, improved upon, and the vaccines have shown that. The vaccines, we ran the phase 1 trial and the phase 2 trial at the same time with a staggered beginning. So actually the phase 1 trial was still running while when the phase 2 trial hit. The phase 2 trial, so a phase 2 trial usually just looks at early signs of, does it maybe work? That phase 2 trial was actually phase 2 and a phase 3 trial. So that means that by the end of the trial, actually we had enough data to be able to go to the licensing authorities. So there were really only 2 phases of that trial rather than the classical at least 3, often more. And they ran at the same time, so everything got concertinaed in. And that there is no reason that trials in the pulmonary hypertension area can't use some of those ideas. It will take a sea change in how our whole community approaches this, and it's going to be not without controversy, because new ideas often will get resistance just because they're new. But I'm very passionate about taking some of this learning and some of these trials I've been involved in, particularly in this COVID period, and then applying the same principles to pulmonary hypertension.
Well, it's it's as you say, it's a process that we've all got to go through, and it won't be without some controversial conversations and decisions to be made. But I think that's the nature of we're trying to find the best ways to make people well and keep a healthy community. So it's going to be different viewpoints always, but I think we are surrounded by a fantastic group of people within the PVRI and sort of from the medical side, and I think there's some fantastic people around, obviously globally who can contribute to all of this.
And I think that's important. I think one of the really brilliant things about the PVRI is it really is genuinely a global organization. You just have to look at the makeup of our groups within the Innovative Drug Discovery Initiative. It has representation from a diverse geographical and spectrum of stakeholders, and so I think the PVRI is brilliant for this, because it's a really wonderful space for connecting people together from different backgrounds and from different areas, and that's one of the things that, for example, in low and middle income communities, we very rarely point drug discovery from day one at therapies that are going to be easy to translate there. And so some of these ideas that we're seeing, in real time over this last couple of years in COVID are totally relevant to some of the challenges that we get and that we see. And the fact that the Pulmonary Vascular Research Institute has a deep commitment to that, I think puts it in a slightly funny and a unique position, actually, for being a kind of agent of change.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Mark, it's been fantastic talking with you. I noticed that we're sort of drawing towards, a good 3/4 of an hour chat, which is wonderful. I just wanted to ask you if you've got anything that that's sort of you'd like to share today. Any thoughts on where we're going, and obviously with the sotatercept, I pronounce it very badly, but with the trials going on, where do you see things going over the next few years? With
Sure. I mean, I think we've had a period where therapy development had one goal, and that was vasodilation, and it was really hard to move on from vasodilation. and there have been a number of attempts that haven't been successful. So it kind of masked the fact that we weren't doing anything new, because a lot of therapies were coming out. Patients' lived experience and lives were improved, but not perhaps transformed in the way that we'd hope. The demonstration of additional ways of targeting the disease really, I think, is really profoundly important right now, because what we want to do is turn, pulmonary hypertension into a chronic manageable condition where we improve life expectancy, a bit like HIV over the years. And the fact that we now have potential other ways to target the same pathology, I think, should be really encouraging to patients out there. And so I think, this is an exciting time to be involved in pulmonary hypertension research. There are risks in trying to do it at this point in a pandemic, and so people also have to maintain their focus and make sure it doesn't slip off the radar. But I think there's some really excellent green shoots there of new ideas translating through, and so I'm just really excited to be involved in it at this point.
Well, it's been fantastic, over the years, learning from you and people like Nick Morell, and having, obviously been very focused on trying to find better treatments, and we're just I'm really happy that we've had a chance to talk today, and to hear more about what's going on, and it's just been fantastic to hear your thoughts.
A pleasure as always. I like the flower in the background. That's obviously not your touch. Yeah.
It's I thought I'd put it there. It's my wife's. She's very good with flowers. I put it there just to sort of brighten up the background a bit. I don't have as many books behind me as you do.
With the photos of the children, though.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Thanks, Jamie. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too, Mark. It's lovely to speak with you, and thanks everyone for listening. We hope it's been interesting for you. This is one of several podcasts put out by the PVRI. We'll also be sharing it on the Dinosaur Trust website. So please check out both our websites, and keep following us, keep following what's going on. We'll be, I'm sure, interviewing more interesting people like Mark, and thank you all for your time. Thank you, Mark, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.